Hello, guys. Thank you for tuning in at wherever you may be and whatever you may doing and taking the time to stop by this channel and to hear me rant about whatever vernacular and dialogue that I may so choose, generally pertaining to our public servants. Now, I am just making this video because I suppose I'm going to try to make at least one or two videos at least a week. But this video specifically, I wanted to touch a little bit on history in regards to taxes. And I have personally a lot going on, doing a writ of mandamus, trying to formulate a writ of quo warranto, doing the due diligence for that, studying, this type of stuff is not easy. I'm sure any auditor that's worth their salt, they already know that. They'll tell you the same thing, unless you're willing to commit the time, really dedicate, like caring about this stuff and comprehending it, not just reading it, but actually really inner and understanding what it means, then most people don't get it. And that's also part of the reason why, you just won't get it unless you're willing to really do those things. And in today's general society with the hustle and bustle, it's kind of hard to do that, I feel. I'm just doing this video off the cuff. I kind of feel like I kind of do my best, I guess, videos of whatever that way. But anyways, so now on to the thing. So this one will be about taxes. This is something that I've kind of already previously thrown together. I just don't think most people are aware of this side of history, as most of this stuff is generally censored and or hard to reach, or you have to go digging very hard. Anyways though, so this is something that I had written to someone that is in, well, I don't really have to get into that, but either way, here we go. Without further ado, into the tax history of our country. And before I go, I encourage anyone to look up stuff that I mention, and verify it. I like people that do their. I mean, not that I just like people, but I encourage, and it makes me happy when people take the time to research and look up things and verify things. That's what it's all about. Not just training our minds to build on foundations of hearsay. It's good to scrutinize. It's good to question. All right, that third minute. Here we go. So I am basically mentioning how I personally do not pay income taxes, because income taxes are unconstitutional, number one, and they only apply to corporate fiction under civil law. Some of these words you may or may not understand. I would encourage you to look these words up in a Black's Law Dictionary, preferably a 4th edition, 1951 to 1968, as those were the editions that the lawyers and barristers did not redact. That is to say that after the 4th edition, the lawyers and barristers started redacting terms that were located within the dictionaries that they did not want most of the public to know. So that is what that is in reference to. So I have the right to contract an unlimited amount of times, as do any of us, and taxes only apply to corporate fiction under civil law. I do not consent, these are things you would say. Me personally, I was saying this in this letter. I do not consent to a lot of things, as I am not a part of a corporation, let alone the American Banknote Corporation. Income tax is unconstitutional, as the government doesn't have the authority to tax the product of a man's labor. I am going to go through great detail in true history to support myself. Income tax is based on statutes in civil law. Tax is defined in Black's Law Dictionary as a charge, usually in monetary, that is by money, imposed by the government on persons, entities, transactions, or property to yield public revenue. So I would just like to point out that it's interesting that the IRS says that it is voluntary in very clear words. Broadly, it embraces all governmental impositions on the person, property, and privilege, which basically is a fancy way of saying that the government doesn't have the right to turn any right into a privilege, which is what, shockingly, unbeknownst to most people, licenses are for, which are turning rights into privileges. Rights aren't self-executing, which means that if you don't know your rights or you don't invoke them, that is to execute them, then that is on you and they won't actually make it known. One needs to assert one's rights, otherwise they won't take effect. Rights are guaranteed in the federal and state constitutions. States can't license rights, point of fact. Quote, a state may not impose a charge for the enjoyment of a right granted by the federal constitution, nor may any state convert any sacred liberty into a privilege and issue a license and a fee for it. And that was settled by Maduke versus Pennsylvania, 319 U.S. 105 in 1943. This other case, quote, if the state does convert your right into a privilege and issues a license and a fee for it, you can ignore the license, fee, and engage the right with impunity. Impunity means, end quote, by the way, impunity means that you cannot lose. You're exempt from a penalty. And that was settled by Shuttlesworth versus Birmingham, Alabama, 373 U.S. 262, 1962. So, my questions would be good questions to ask yourself even. Where is my proof that I consented to anything unconstitutional or not adjacent with common law? Most taxes, especially income, are a prime example of accroaching, which is to exercise power without authority. Under the Constitution of the United States, ultimate power rests with the people. Constitution prohibits Congress from passing any laws which apply ex post facto. So, under common law, basically, natural free men and women don't have to pay for taxes, and all these corporations wanting our tax returns would require and does require each of us to do our taxes, which is we have the right to not self-incriminate ourselves. So that's a violation right there, and we also have a Fourth Amendment right, which is to be secure in our persons and papers. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but it's like persons, papers, and unnecessary seizures, et cetera, et cetera. So to recap, under common law, natural free men and women don't have to pay for taxes, and all these corporations wanting tax returns and requiring us to do it is a violation, as we are not corporate fiction, nor do I, and nor should most of us, consent. And a little known fact, judges are bound by what's called stare decisis, as there is precedence, and that's Latin for to stand by things decided. As there is precedence for not paying income tax, property tax, and that depends on the wording and whether or not it's actually supportable by uniform commercial code, common law, and or civil law. I'm stating that in many ways, I don't consent to contract through foreign corporations. What privilege, this is another good question, what privilege, benefit, or immunity am I using that gives the IRS jurisdiction when I don't consent, nor did I ever consent, to adhesion contracts in any form that remove rights and replace them with privileges and that require unlawful fees? Uniform Commercial Code 1-308 clearly says that I don't consent to having any manner of my property or assets, in whatever form that entails, pledged as collateral for the national debt. UCC 1-308 just basically reserves your right in any signature of transaction in commerce. So that's how that generally is a way to safeguard your signature. I don't consent to having any manner of my property or assets in whatever form that entails pledged as collateral for the national debt. Because we're like 30-ish trillion dollars in debt, and we've also been bankrupt since roughly 1933, and they've pledged each and every one of us as collateral through our birth certificates. I know it sounds crazy, but you can look this up. It's called the Cestui Que Trust Act of 1666. You also can't make those numerals up either. But all it takes is a little digging, and you can see that that is the foundation for basically what is still going on. And I'm going to continue now. It's usually pledged as collateral for the national debt, and I don't consent to that. And in the future, any and all of my titles, as should all of any person's titles, you should request allidium titles, which means that I owe no fees to the government in regards to property tax, school tax, real estate tax, etc. But you can look up allodium or allidium. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's spelled Allodium. Look that up in a Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition. Furthermore, because I have the right to unlimited contract, as do any of us, I reserve my rights, and me personally, I'm in the process of learning more and also regaining more of my rights, which have been lost, but only due to former niches, which obviously isn't the case now. I no longer accept benefits from or consent to contract with the federal government, which means I also don't have to pay Social Security tax, federal income tax, or individual state income tax. No one even needs a license to drive. But that's a separate matter, and I can do another video on that on another day. I'm not even trying to get into that right now. Let's stick to the tax stuff. So, birth certificates, which is what I was just touching on just a couple seconds earlier, are really banknotes being traded on the stock market. And me personally, I have looked up mine directly, which was tied to my social security number, as it is tied to all of ours. Seeing is believing, and the importance of critical investigation and cross-correlation cannot be understated here. I was too young, as were all of us, to give consent at our birth, which automatically renders the contract null and void. So I will be employing or at least I'm looking into employing Uniform Commercial Code 3-104 and 3-305 and whatever other relevant information in regards to common, UCC, or civil law to bolster, support, and prove whatever I am conveying, as well as collecting what is rightfully mine. I don't consent to being a, quote, commodity, end quote, being traded on the stock market in over 130 different accounts all over the world. Like I said, I looked it up. That's the truth. I went to dtcc.com, and you just go in there, make an account, and I made an account, and I went to search QSIP, CUSIP /LEI numbers, typed in my social security number with the hyphen. Anybody can do this, and bam, all that stuff popped up. So if it was conspiracy theory, I would like to know how that is explained. So anyways, back to this. I am the rightful owner of the stock on the stock market in over 130 different countries over the world, and I am the rightful owner. I misread that. I am the rightful owner of the bonds. There we go. Being traded, representing my corporate fiction, and that is your name in all capital letters. Take a look at your driver's license. Take a look at anything generally you get from the court. Anytime you go to court, take a look at your ID or any other form of ID. It's usually in all capital letters. There's a reason for that. That's dictated by the U.S. Printing Styles Manual. And only corporations have to have all capital letters in their name. So
back to this. I uh, I am the one. I am the rightful owner of the bonds being traded representing my corporate fiction, not the account holders. My inalienable rights protect me and bar me from anything in regards to the aforementioned. Um, I will. Part of that, is making oaths to your state, and this has nothing to do with a sovereign citizen either. Let me make that clarification. You want to make oaths to your state. Notices that I'm using Federal Reserve notes under protest because really it's just fiat currency and it's based off of nothing. My revocation of signature for driver's license, which I'm currently writing a writ of mandamus for, that's what I was referencing earlier. I'm using, as well as legally eliminating income, federal, and state taxes, which is legal, etc., etc. I have lots that I'm doing. And I don't consent to being traded by bond through MERS. That's an acronym, MERS. Look that up. All of this ends up being reported and sent by the birth certificates, by the Department of Commerce to the International Monetary Fund. And we all know, this is sarcasm here, just what a great group of people these are. I am sorry for this book, to my listeners, in case I'm boring anyone with this. I hope I'm not. This is good information. But I'm just trying to be as thorough as possible and not leave any holes in here. And so here are examples of our history as to how we got here now and the most relevant cases pertaining towards income tax towards the end. So the Maternity Act made all of this possible by selling the birth certificates as a way to, quote, reduce infant mortality, protecting the health of mothers and infants, and for, quote, other purposes, end quote. It created federal children. The other purpose is, quote, selective disclosure, which is defined as the act of divulging part of a privileged communication or one of several communications, usually because the divulged portion is helpful to the party giving the information. In most cases, that is the government. While harmful portions of the communication, excuse me, I got the hiccups, while harmful portions of the communications are withheld. So that is what selective disclosure means. And let's take a word here. Let's break down that word government, okay? That's govern, okay, and ment. What's your ment? That's your mentality. You got to start breaking down words and making these connections here. Under the doctrine of parens patriae, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but that's spelled Parens space Patriae. It makes it so that the government legislation for American children is if they are owned by the federal government. As we age and go through public school, which I hate to say it, but as I'm looking back, and especially now in current society, I can clearly see how most public schools is just an indoctrination centers. If you think about it, it's a 12-step program, kind of like all these other 12-step programs. The difference is the 12 steps are just the 12 grades, grades 1 through 12. We go through these indoctrination centers thinking that we have to ask for so many things that we actually don't. That's the problem. Utter and total ignorance. This is just important facts as I'm going down here. 64% of our Constitution is either reasoned from statements made in Deuteronomy or from commentaries on it. And that was proven in a 7-year study from Houston around 1984. 15,284 sources were gone through and vetted and used as reference for that study. The connection between the Bible and the Constitution is common law. And I don't think a lot of people know that. And I would add to that statement, I don't think enough people know that. Marriage licenses, as another example, only came in when people of different races wanted to marry. Roberts versus Roberts in the U.S. Supreme Court says that when you go and apply for a marriage license, you allow the state to become a third party in your marriage because you gave up the right to a conjugal relationship at law by the laws of man. So why would anyone do that? Every time you get a license, basically, you lose a right. And the worst part is most people do it voluntarily, and that's the fundamental problem. With all of this, in 1933, the U.S. went bankrupt, and the governors of, the then 48 states pledged the full faith and credit of their states, including the citizenry, as collateral for loans of credit from the Federal Reserve System, which is not federal at all. It's privately owned. I'd also like to take this moment just to say that, I love my country, and, I can't say it enough that I don't consent to any of this. And, I don't understand, which is another fancy term for, understand in a court of law means that, that you agree to stand under and give consent to the jurisdiction and the authority of, whether it's a court or whether it's a public servant, and that is a police officer. When they ask you if you understand, that's really what that means, and that's called legalese. The Federal Reserve is privately owned. Full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, Article 4, Section 1, is very telling. How many know that the state claims an interest in every child within its jurisdiction? The state will, if it deems it necessary, nullify your parental rights and appoint a trustee over your children. Interestingly, I would also like to point out that CPS loses thousands of children annually. The last time I checked, assuming that this person's sources were correct, I like to say that just for the potential of error, but roughly 2,200 children go missing a day from Child Protective Services here in the United States of America. So I think that is a staggering statistic, assuming its legitimacy. I encourage anyone that's watching this to please look into that, comment, let me know. I have so much on my plate, and I'm going through so much. I'm just trying to, give back what I can while balancing so many things that are going on in my own personal life. But everyone is my brother and sister, and I'm only doing what one man can. So back to this thing that I've written. Anyway, so they will nullify your rights, and they will appoint a trustee over your children. And they lose all these children annually in 2,200 roughly a day, as I just pointed out. And every time a child gets put up for adoption, they get $85,000 from the federal government every time that they're taken and put up for adoption. It's a money game, says former prosecutor Robert Wiedner. I will, soon myself be requesting my actual birth certificate when I, finalize the process and have it fully, the word that I'm trying to think of here is lacking me, unfortunately. But basically, when I know the process like the back of my hands, basically, is what I'm trying to say. That's when I'm going to be doing all this and starting that. But I will be requesting my actual certificate of live birth, not a birth certificate copy. It's important to make that distinction. As another example as to why I'm no longer a part of this and I reserve my rights. A birth certificate, as they are used today, is not lawfully the same as a certified copy. State of states are just local franchises of the federal corporation defined in USC 3002 parentheses 15. I have no interest in foreign corporations, and I didn't consent to and never knew that this was happening, and which is to say that this happened without my knowledge. So many have been mischaracterized and defrauded that we all have prima facie evidence of that. Our birth certificates. What it is in reality is a certification that a federal municipal person, in all caps, was created and named after you, and that at one point in your life you were a real American. We're all born on our birthday, but the municipal person, that is your name in all caps, has a birth date which is a few days or weeks later, which is the filing date shown on your birth certificate. Relevant fact: the purpose of any corporation is to make money for its owners and shareholders. So natural law and common law are the only laws that apply to humans where they deal with harming other people or causing them loss, and otherwise a human has free reign and unlimited entitlement to do anything he chooses which complies with these principles. However, statutes and contracts do not apply to a human in reality, but only the all caps name, which is a legal personality / fiction, like all corporations. In regards to tax and a lot of things in general, number one, full disclosure hasn't been met. Number two, equal consideration is almost unheard of these days. Number three, lawful terms and conditions need apply, and as a result, a lot of the aforementioned isn't, and is therefore based on fraud, which is not my opinion, it's not conspiracy theory, but fact. And just another interesting fact, the term conspiracy theory was created by the Central Intelligence Agency, that's the CIA, during the JFK assassination to dissuade, any interest and the members of the public listening to any relevant testimony from any credible witnesses or credible experts in regards to, like I said, the JFK assassination. That they created that phrase, and it's being parroted to this day. So every time someone says conspiracy theory, conspiracy theorist, congratulations, in case you didn't know, you're just regurgitating the CIA's one of their many catchphrases. As crazy as it is. Look up Operation Mockingbird. It'll be very enlightening for you. So back to this. So number four. The signatures of both parties need to be on a contract, and fictitious entities cannot sign something in real life, nor can they appoint someone else to do it for them, as it's quite literally legal fiction. Corporations can't sign because they have no right or mind to contract, since they are, again, legal fictions. That means they're not real, like you and I. They're not a natural person. And this is the most important part, and a third party cannot sign on their behalf. So a good example of this is I can go to Bank of America. Bank of America cannot actually sign my contract if I get a loan with them. Sure, their company name will be on the piece of paper, but someone, an actual human being is the person that I'm, is overseeing, my transaction with the bank. And they're helping me sign whatever paper they're probably signing off and saying that I witnessed this transaction, etc., etc. That's why that's going down, and that's why this is a contradiction with all of that. Just as an example, former President Andrew Jackson's words speak to me as they should to you. Quote, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the banks of the United States. I have had men watching you for a long time, and am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, that I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. If I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and then that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal, as he brought his fist down on the table, "I will rout you out." End quote. Andrew Jackson, shortly before ending the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. And that's from the original minutes of the Philadelphia Committee of Citizens sent to meet with President Jackson in February 1834, according to Andrew Jackson in the Bank of the United States in 1928 by Stan versus Henkels. So shortly after, President Jackson, the only American president to actually pay off the national debt, ended the Second Bank of the United States. There was an attempted assassination which failed when both pistols used by the assassin, Richard Lawrence, failed to fire. Lawrence later said that with Jackson dead, quote, "money would be more plentiful," end quote. I wonder why. Unless I feel that unless I prove, cite, make reasonable points, that, someone could just say that all this is hearsay and, all things considered, that's the point of discussion in general, to show complexity where one once only saw simplicity. Of course, the present-day American public school system is as subservient to the bankers' wishes to keep certain items of history from you, just as the corporate media is subservient to Monsanto's wishes to keep the dangers of genetically modified foodstuffs from you, and the global warming cult's wishes to conceal from you the fact that the Earth has actually been cooling for the last 16 years. Thus, it should come as little surprise that much of the real reasons for the events of the Civil War are not well known to the average American. When the Confederacy seceded from the United States, the bankers once again saw the opportunity for a rich harvest of debt and offered to fund Lincoln's efforts to bring the South back into the Union, but at a 30% interest. Lincoln remarked that he would not free the black man, I'm just quoting here, by enslaving the white man to the bankers and using his authority as president. He issued a new government currency, the greenback. This was a direct threat to the wealth and power of the central bankers, who responded quickly. Quote, "If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, becomes entrenched, then that government will issue its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous to a degree which is without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will migrate to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." End quote. And that was the London Times responding to Lincoln's decision to issue government greenbacks to finance the Civil War, rather than agree to private bankers' loans at 30% interest. In 1872, New York bankers sent a letter to every bank in the United States, urging them to fund any newspapers which opposed government-issued money, which was Lincoln's greenbacks. Quote, "Dear Sir, it is advisable to do all in your power to sustain such prominent daily and weekly newspapers as will oppose the issuing of greenback paper money, and that you will also withhold patronage or favors from all applicants who are not willing to oppose the government issue of money. Let the government issue the coin and the banks issue the paper money of the country. To restore to circulation the government issue of money will be to provide the people with money, and will therefore seriously affect your individual profit as bankers and lenders." End quote. The Triumphant Plutocracy and the Story of the American Public Life from 1870 to 1920 by Lynn Wheeler. Quote, "It will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that." End quote. Once again, the Triumphant Plutocracy, the Story of American Public Life from 1870 to 1920 by Lynn Wheeler. Quoting again, "Slavery is likely to be abolished by the war, power and chattel slavery destroyed. This I and my European friends are in favor of, for slavery is but the owning of labor and carries with it the care for the laborer, while the European plan, led on by England, is for capital to control labor by controlling the wages. This can be done by controlling the money. End quote. Those are very important words, that last sentence. Once again, the triumphant plutocracy, the story of the American public life from 1870 to 1920 by Lynn Wheeler. Goaded by the private bankers, much of Europe supported the Confederacy against the Union, with the expectation that victory over Lincoln, would mean the end of the greenback. France and Britain considered an outright attack on the United States to aid the Confederacy, but were held at bay by Russia, which had just ended the... Sorry, man, I'm getting lost. Were just ended by Russia, which had just ended the serfdom system and had a state central bank similar to the system the United States had been founded on. Left free of European intervention, the Union won the war, and Lincoln announced his intention to go on issuing greenbacks. Following Lincoln's assassination, the greenbacks were pulled from circulation, and the American people were forced to go back to an economy based on banknotes borrowed at interest from the private bankers. Finally, in 1913, the private central bankers of Europe, in particular the Rothschilds of Great Britain and the Warburgs of Germany, met with their American financial collaborators on Jekyll Island. I also believe J.P. Morgan was a part of that. In Georgia, they met on Jekyll Island in Georgia to form a new banking cartel with the express purpose of forming the third bank of the United States, with the aim of placing complete control of the United States money supply once again under the control of the private bankers. Owing to hostility over the previous banks, the name was changed to the Federal Reserve System in order to grant the new bank a quasi-governmental image. But in fact, it is a privately owned bank, no more federal than Federal Express. Indeed, in 2012, the Federal Reserve successfully rebuffed a Freedom of Information lawsuit by Bloomberg News on the grounds that as a private banking corporation and not actually a part of the government, the Freedom of Information Act did not apply to the operations of the Federal Reserve. Now we're going back in history just for more clarification. The year in 1913 proved to be a transformative year for the nation's economy. First, with the passage of the 16th Income Tax Amendment and the false claim that it had been ratified. Quote, I think that if you were to go back and try to find and review the ratification of the 16th Amendment, which was the internal revenue, the income tax, I think that if you went back and examined that carefully, you would find that a sufficient number of states never ratified that amendment. End quote. U.S. District Court Judge James C. Fox, Sullivan versus United States, 2003. Later in 1913, that's just a relevant case. Later in 1913, apparently unwilling to risk another questionable amendment, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act over the Christmas holiday. While members of Congress who were opposed to the measure were at home, this was a very underhanded deal as the Constitution, which explicitly grants Congress the authority to issue the public currency, does not authorize it to delegate that authority. And so, it should have required a new amendment to allow Congress to transfer that authority to a private bank. But Congress did pass it, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it as he had promised the bankers that he would in exchange for generous campaign contributions. The next year, 1914, World War I started. And it is important to remember that prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. Wilson later regretted that decision, stating, quote, I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. End quote. Woodrow Wilson, 1919. The First World War started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but quickly shifted to focus to Germany, whose industrial capacity was seen as an economic threat to Great Britain, who saw the decline of the British pound as a result of too much emphasis on financial activity to the neglect of agriculture, industrial development, and infrastructure, not unlike the present-day United States. Now, although pre-war Germany had a private central bank, that bank was heavily restricted, and inflation was kept to reasonable levels. Under government control, investment was guaranteed to internal economic development, and Germany was seen as a major power. So, in the media of the day, Germany was portrayed as the prime instigator of World War I, and subsequently not just defeated, but had its industrial base flattened. Following the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was ordered to pay the war costs of all of the participating nations, even though Germany had not actually started the war. This amounted to 3 times the value of all of Germany itself. Germany's private central bank, to whom Germany had gone deeply into debt to pay the cost of the war, broke free of government control and massive inflation followed, which was mostly triggered by currency speculators, which permanently trapped the German people in endless debt. When the Weimar Republic collapsed economically, it opened the door for the National Socialists to take power. Their first financial move was to issue their own state currency, which wasn't borrowed from the private central bankers. Freed from having to pay interest on the money in circulation, Germany blossomed and quickly began to rebuild its industry. The media called it, quote, the German miracle. Time magazine lionized Hitler for the amazing improvement in life for the German people and the explosion of German history, and even named him Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. Adolf Hitler, you heard that right. Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. I wonder how many people are aware of these things. Philander Knox, Secretary of State at the time, was complicit in lying to the American people by telling them that the 16th Amendment had been legally ratified by the states, which it hadn't. It was all for and at the behest of bankers J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, and John D. Rockefeller. Quote, the law that never was, end quote, is a great source. I believe that's a book. This has also been cited in a fairly recent court case, which was the one that I had mentioned earlier, cited by U.S. District Court Judge James C. Fox in 2003. So in 1913, the bankers did another fraud by bribing senators to pass the act, and while they got that act passed, they did it without the required constitutional amendment, and they did it while most of the senators were home with their families during Christmas vacation. You know, you got to think, this wasn't in the time of phones like it is now, you know. So that was kind of a big deal. That's how we got the Federal Reserve Act. Bankers won and the people lost because politicians will sell their soul for $1, man. Mayor Rothschild, a private banker, is quoted as saying, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." End quote. That should tell you everything you need to know about, you know, the mentality that these people have. Government gave the bankers one of the most important powers and now had to borrow the money from them with interest to finance the government. So we've made our brothers and sisters in America lower their standard of living and force most to pay a graduated income tax to the government just because it's more profits for the banks. Cue in Woodrow Wilson's quote about regretting that act. So I just want to give a history as to how we got here instead of, you know, just saying I don't pay taxes because of blah blah blah, sovereign citizen, BS, blah, blah, blah. I'm not affiliated with that. I'm providing substance for my claims. I'm encouraging people to look this stuff up. If I'm wrong about something, I may be wrong about something. I'm not infallible, but I definitely done my due diligence and looked the vast majority of this stuff up. I didn't just make this stuff up. This comes from a lot of time studying, but I will continue. In continuance, the income tax is illegal, nor is it lawful. And yes, there is a difference between lawful and legal, because it would be a direct tax and it's not apportioned as the Constitution demands. John Turner, a former IRS agent, is quoted as saying, quote, "I clearly couldn't find a statute that made a person liable and made the choice to resign," end quote. Joe Bannister, another IRS criminal investigator, said, quote, "I had to leave the IRS because of evidence that I had accumulated showing that the agency was violating the law and violating people's rights, and I asked the agency for a response to my sincere concerns, and the answer that I got was they would not answer my questions and that they gave me papers for my resignation," end quote. So that's wild to me. Sherry Jackson, another former IRS agent, is quoted as saying that there is a We the People Foundation for the Constitutional Education put a full-page ad. This is her quote. Put a full-page ad on USA Today in July 7th, 2000 newspaper, and within the body of that ad was a $50,000 challenge for anyone that could show the law requiring income tax. So to her, $50,000 is, to me, $50,000 is a lot of money. Sorry, this is her quote. So I went after that and did the research based on the fact that I thought, let's put this baby to bed. I'm hearing all these rumors. I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'll answer these people's questions that they're asking me, and then I'll win this $50,000. Based on the research that I did throughout the year 2000 and that I'm still doing, I have not found that law. I've asked Congress, I've asked a lot of people in the IRS commissioners' helpers, etc. They can't answer, because if they answer, the American people are going to know that this whole thing is a fraud, end quote. At the time of recording these things that I am referencing to you, approximately 67 million people didn't file income tax returns, and they joined the ranks, and who can blame them? American citizens, along with foundations relating to issues like these, have asked the IRS to specifically provide the underlying legal foundation upon which they administer and enforce the personal income tax laws in our country. Why do commissioners of the IRS refuse to acknowledge or evade the question? It doesn't make sense. It's suspicious. David Johnston, when he was at the New York Times, asked Terry Lemons in the IRS, quote, "Why won't the IRS answer the questions set forth in the petitions from the American people?" To which Lemons responded, "The government is answering the questions through enforcement actions in the courts," end quote. That is a chilling, tyrannical, imposing, repulsive, morally devoid statement. Brute force over civility and logic? Again, my brothers and sisters, I don't consent and neither should you. There is no law that requires the average American worker in the private sector to pay a direct, unapportioned tax on their labor in compensation for services. Quote, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who think that they are free," end quote. And that was Goth that said that. Proceeds from income tax don't contribute to highway construction. The gas tax does. It takes care of all of it. The money that we spend annually on defense is the exact same amount as the corporate income tax. Income tax, and that should be an important fact, income tax is the instrument of totalitarianism. This means the means which a government can warp you into complete servitude. Most are required to be totally transparent, and under the law, the IRS is supposed to do the same. And if you lie, you can go to prison. But they are also required to send a financial statement that shows where our money goes and where it went, except that they don't usually comply, and they expect everyone else to. In 1999, the Department of Defense had $1.1 trillion of undocumentable adjustments. Don't you just love that wording? Undocumentable adjustments. Next year, in 2000, they had 2.3 trillion in undocumentable adjustments. What does that say? State Representative Phil Hart, at the time, I don't know if he's currently still a representative, but Phil Hart said, quote, "When you look through the statutes, you cannot identify a law that says the average person that earns a wage has to pay an income tax." End quote. A direct tax must be apportioned, and that's the U.S. Constitution. All indirect taxes must be the same in every state. U.S. Constitution. Supreme Court Stanton versus Baltic Mining says, quote, "The provisions of the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation." Doyle versus Mitchell. Stratton Independence versus Hobart. Bowers versus Kerbo Empire. Peter Gibbons, tax attorney. Those were just relevant cases. You can look those up. Just for clarification and potential research purposes, I will repeat them. That is Supreme Court Stanton versus Baltic Mining, Doyle versus Mitchell, Stratton Independence versus Hobart, Bowers versus Kerbo Empire. And I am now quoting Peter Gibbons, tax attorney. Quote, "It's really quite simple. Congress tried to enact an income tax in 1894, and the Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. When the Supreme Court says something is unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional. Again, they tried in 1913, and the Supreme Court said, quote, the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation, end quote. So they never have had the authority to tax the living and working wages within the 50 states, period. New York Times, January 25th, 1916 says, in substance, the court holds that the 16th Amendment did not empower the federal government to levy a new tax in a letter from Daniel Inouye's office. I'm going to spell his name, so it's Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L, and then his last name is spelled I-N-O-U-Y-E. Inouye, I think that's how it's pronounced. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So Daniel Inouye's office of the United States Senate, and it says, quote, based on the research by the Congressional Research Service, there is no provisions which require an individual to pay an income tax, end quote. So now I guess I didn't realize, but I actually did cover at least Doyle versus Mitchell seemingly. So here is Doyle versus Mitchell, 247 U.S. 179, 1918. In which it says, quote, the idea of gain or increase arising, or so that it is the idea of gain or increase, blah, arising from corporate activity. In other words, it doesn't mean wages, it doesn't mean dividends, it doesn't mean alimony. It means a gain or a profit arising from corporate activity. And once again, I'm not a corporation, you're not a corporation, and if any of these words I'm telling you start to make sense to you, you're not a fictitious entity. Neither are any of us. We're natural flesh and blood humans. In 2003, the illegal tax on your labor collected $927.2 billion. The legal corporate income tax collected $278.3 billion. Remember, legal is not lawful, and it's important to make that distinction. Legal usually refers to civil law, while lawful usually refers to common law. Civil law derives its authority from common law, just for informational purposes. Tax liens are nothing more than allegations, as they are non-substantive and they have never been determined by a neutral third party to have a shred of validity. The government simply knows that most people don't have the time, intellect, passion, funds, or ability to counter-argue and prove and cite important information, hence why they, quote, legally, end quote, seize someone's property. The income tax that's being used now does not meet the criteria of either direct or indirect tax. Title 18 of the U.S. Criminal Code is very specific as to what violates, and in Title 26 of the IRS Revenue Code, there is nothing specific. Even one of the authors of the tax code and former Commissioner Sheldon Cohen gave an interview which is very telling. IRS Code 26 CFR Chapter 1 on the edition of April 1st, 2003 clearly states that it is voluntary to comply. And, quote, it is to assist taxpayers with attaining maximum voluntary compliance by informing service personnel and the public of national office interpretation. So, as if their interpretation matters anyway, the people decide and have the power as governments exist by consent of the governed. In the IRS code, the word income is also not defined. I think that's kind of problematic. The Supreme Court, once again, however, has ruled that income is defined as not wages or labor, but rather gains from corporate activity. The Supreme Court has also said that your labor is your private property. It's that simple. Once again, I apologize to anyone for this book, but I mean, really, if you did not come to hopefully learn something informational or enlightening, then, I wouldn't really want you to be doing something that you didn't really want to do, but I hope people really listen to these words and take the time to research anything that they may question if they doubt me, and that's totally fine. I'm just some guy on a video on the internet that you're watching right now. But I'm encouraging you to look these things that I'm telling you up, and you will see that, a lot of this stuff is true. So, that's really just the gist of it. But back to this, I am almost done. So, the Supreme Court has said that your labor is your private property. But I'm just giving you guys tons of information that is relevant. So if anyone is able to disprove what I've said, I'm all ears. The Supreme Courts are very clear. Quote, the income tax is we've already read that. With all respect and eagerness in regards to this relevant and informational I guess, lecture paper that I have, typed up here. I really want to try and give you guys, anyone that comes across my channel, access to information that you may not really come across often, and that's really, one of my main things. The law, this is also another interesting point, the law says that the word voluntary, as used in Flora and in IRS publications, refers to our system of allowing taxpayers to determine the correct amount of tax and complete the appropriate returns, rather than have the government determine tax for them. The requirement to file an income tax return is not voluntary and is clearly set forth in Internal Revenue Code 6011A, 6012A, and et SEQ dot and 6072A. See also TREAS regulation 1.6011-1A. And to me, this is a classic example of doublespeak. Notice the contradiction, where, they say that, the word voluntary refers to the system of allowing taxpayers to determine the correct amount, and that the requirement to file a tax return is not voluntary, and it's clearly set forth in Internal Revenue Code. Here's the thing: codes are not laws. Codes and statutes are not laws. So they can have that code all they want. The Supreme Court has been very clear. I'm not going to repeat it, but you already know what I'm going to say. Your labor is your private property. They cannot tax you on it, and it refers from gains to corporate activity. I just contradicted myself there. I said I wasn't going to say it, but I said it because I just want to make sure people really understand these points. So, doublespeak is basically, they're trying to, say one thing while doing another, or trying to perpetuate a false notion while doing another. And I actually may be wrong with that. I just don't have doublespeak. Like, I'm not pulling it up. It means something to that effect. It's basically in an effort to conceal the reality of something. That's what doublespeak means. But definitely look that one up, doublespeak. So I implore anyone to show me a statute given all of the information aforementioned. And these are two more cases that the IRS has actually lost. Anybody, just for reference, that anybody can look up, and that is Vernice Kuglin, and that's spelled Vernice, Kuglin, Kuglin, and Galen Whitley Harrell is the other one. And that is Gaylon space Whitley space Harroll. After all of this, the fact that the courts are bound by stare decisis, why are any of us paying taxes, is really the question that we should be asking ourselves. I will do my taxes if it can be shown to me where in the specific wording that doesn't contradict previous Supreme Court decisions. Because the Supreme Court of the United States is the supreme law of the land, which means that it doesn't matter what any of the other subordinate state Supreme Courts say, they cannot overturn or override a decision from SCOTUS, which is the Supreme Court of the United States. So with all of that being said, this is Ryan of the Solis and Wolverton Familia signing off. Hopefully you guys learned something. I appreciate anybody that made it through the full video. If you do, you guys are champs. I'm not popular right now. I don't have a lot of people, but I'm trying. I'm doing what I can. It's also cool. Shout out to Long Island Audit for coming down to Charlestown, West Virginia. I know there's been tons of us that have been sending in videos, but it's just awesome to see him come down and review the magistrate courthouse the Jefferson County area. He reviewed the probation office, but the same officers, Lieutenant Pittenger and Willie Potter, they were in as well. They were in that same video, so it was just very very satisfying to watch that he came down. And just want to say a shout out to you, Sean. I appreciate all that you do, and just trying to be informative to everyone. So with all that being said, hope everybody has a wonderful day, and may the Creator bless all of us. Have a good one.